This is the Powered Up Podcast, show 29.
But it's that feeling. I was thinking when you were saying that you do all the work before and then you just like do the teaching there. And I think that's when the magic happens. Like when you're interacting in small groups with students and working on these projects together and just moving from group to group and listening to what they're saying, that's when you're assessing them, but that's when they're becoming student scientists.
Welcome to a real-world education with insight and advice from teachers in the game, where current and former educators reveal what truly sets apart the great teachers and what it takes to make a positive impact on students. Whether you're in pre-service learning, new to the game, or a seasoned veteran, this is the show for you. You'll leave feeling inspired to take action because we are powering education by empowering you.
What's going on, everyone? This is Ken Ehrman, host of the Powered Up Podcast, and I am here with my co-host, Mr. Matt Road Tripping Rogers. So, Matt, as we were preparing for our episode tonight, we've heard about your big road trip in our previous show, and we found out that you literally drove past the house of our guest tonight. And just to remind everybody, we live in eastern Pennsylvania, and you drove by the house of our guest in southeastern Montana. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct. So about the halfway point of our trip, we went from South Dakota, the Black Hills, and made our way north. And my wife and I decided to take a detour into Wyoming that led us into Montana. And there is a very long but beautiful road that runs from right up past our house, and we drove by on the way to Theodore Roosevelt, which is unreal, and an incredible food stop that I wish I could remember because she probably should know, and I'm sure she does, but an unbelievable and gorgeous area she was recording from tonight. I am definitely jealous.
Yeah, very, very, very funny that you, like I said, literally were on the road that her house is on. Now, we will find out that her town is very small, and there's not many roads, so that's why it was very easy for her to narrow that down. So we have a fantastic guest tonight, Linda Rost from Montana. She's the 2020 Teacher of the Year. And so a part of what we talk about tonight is taking risks and trying things and just doing it with your class to figure out, does it stick? Does it work? Do I want to do it again? So I actually kind of want to have some fun with this topic. Ironically, Matt has no idea what I'm talking about right now. I found something in our recording platform that speaks to this idea of taking risks and trying things and just finding out if it's good or not. And I literally, like I said, I discovered this before you and Linda came on our recording platform, which is riverside.fm. Shout out to them. We're still super happy with it. So I'm going to have some fun here, and I'm going to redo our intro, and you'll find out why. So here we go. Hey, what's going on, everyone? This is Ken Ehrman, host of the Powered Up Podcast. And I am here with my co-host, Mr. Matt Road Tripping Rogers. Could you hear those sounds?
Not at all.
No?
No, I have no clue what you're talking about.
Oh, well, that did not work at all. So I have laughing sound effects, cheering sound effects. So I cheered for myself, and then when I introduced you, I prompted the laughs. So
oh, great.
Maybe that'll come through on our recording so everybody else could hear it, or maybe it won't. So this would be the case of trying something with my class and never doing it again. So we'll go with that. But seriously, when have you done this with your class where you have an idea, you try something new, and you're open and honest about it, where you're telling your students that you're doing it for the first time? Just kind of speak to that real quick, and then we'll jump into our interview with Linda.
I think that it happens way more than we give credit for. Ken talks about kind of flying by the seat of your pants, which is not a really great depiction. There's a lot of prep work that allows you to have flexibility in the classroom. But the idea of letting the students' curiosity and really leaning into these teachable moments is the tangents that the kids think that they're getting us off topic. And there are times that happens, but a lot of times we wrap what their interests are into what we're trying to teach. And those teachable moments, those opportunities to impart wisdom or really kind of expand and extend those conversations happens all the time. And that's something that needs to always be encouraged. We always need to encourage it's okay to take 3 minutes to go in this direction, or a kid asks a really great question, but it's not perfectly related. You can make a decision. Do you want to address it then or address it later? And it's okay to do in the whole class. It's okay to do as a small group. It's okay to do individually. All of those things are more than fine.
Absolutely. And I really like how Linda talks to this, and she speaks in detail about what these things look like in her classroom. Very complex projects. She talks about the stepping stones to get to that complex point. But for someone that doesn't teach high school science, I very easily followed along with the picture that she was painting. She talks about a project that involves multiple classes at the high school level, where it starts in one, it goes to another science class, and it ends in a social studies class, which was just incredible to hear about. And so she really provides a lot of insight into how to do this, and I think the mindset behind how you can take this approach to doing open-ended learning and the benefits that we see with students. So without any further delay, let's jump into our interview with Linda. Hi, Linda. Welcome to the Powered Up Podcast. How you doing today?
Good, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing very well. We're super excited to have you here. So just to start things off for us, officially introduce yourself. Tell our audience where you're coming from and what your education journey has looked like, kind of in a snapshot for us.
All right, I am Linda Rost. I'm the 2020 Montana Teacher of the Year, and I've been teaching 14 years in Southeast Montana in a really rural area. I taught 7 years in 7 through 12 science, and then I taught the last 7 years in 10 through 12 science. And I actually started off as a range science major. That was my bachelor's degree. And I couldn't find a job in that, and then a teaching job popped up, and I applied for it, and I loved it after like a week. I was like, I'm hooked. This is what I want to do. So that's kind of how it started. And then I had a journey of getting certified as a teacher and learning how to be a teacher. And so here I am today, and I have a couple master's degrees, and I'm working on a PhD now in curriculum instruction.
Wow, that's
very,
very impressive background. What would you say, being an experienced teacher and now going for multiple masters, going for your PhD, is there anything in those programs that you are learning or being exposed to or being forced to think about that is making you rethink the way you teach, or just look at your day-to-day instruction in a different way?
Yeah, I think any time that you're in like the space as a learner, you really rethink what it's like to teach and what it's like to have learners. And so I think that's why I'm so drawn to continuing my education. I don't know what I'll do after I finish, but I think that like I had to take some really hard stats classes, and so being in that space and like not knowing what was going on, I could kind of understand how like my chemistry classes were sometimes when they were struggling through content, and I could kind of like empathize with them and remember what that was like, because if I've taught chemistry 14 times, I'm going to forget what it's like to be a learner. So I think just that piece, just always being a learner and always challenging yourself, I think that's a really important part for a teacher. But I also learn a lot of cool methods. So like getting a master's in education, they're going to show you a lot of really neat methods that you can use for your students. So that's also really helped me. So those are the two reasons why I keep doing it.
So I love the point that you made, and I want to poke this a little bit further about the experience of being a learner, because I 100% agree with you. I do at times, I'll teach graduate courses for teachers about instructional technology and other aspects. And there are times where I'll give directions or we'll talk about the next, 3 steps that we're going to do. And half of the class didn't pay attention. They weren't listening. They don't know what to do. And I don't get upset at all. It's just a relaxed atmosphere of professionals. But I'll say to them, I want you to remember this moment where you were not paying attention. Don't yell at your kids tomorrow for doing the same thing. But what I find is, and teachers, any teacher listening to this will know, any faculty meeting we joke around, teachers are the worst students. But I believe that, and I just think we're all just normal in the sense that it's hard to pay attention at times or whatever those circumstances are. But why does it seem that that feeling for so many teachers is short-lived? Like, why do you think we experience that, we feel that way, but then it doesn't last in terms of having maybe more realistic expectations for students? Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think that we're focused on ourselves sometimes. Like sometimes I'm not focused on the learner and I'm just focused on what I'm saying and what I'm doing. And I assume that the words coming out of my mouth, they're learning and just absorbing automatically. But it's so much more complex than that, right? Like that interaction between the students and what's going on with all the humans, and you have 30 humans in your room. I think that we like disconnect from that because it's a lot of work. I mean, it's a lot of work to be plugged into all of those students and be thinking about what's going on in their head and how they're learning and how they're interacting with the content. So I think it's a lot. I mean, I think that's a lot to have another human being consider when they're like, what other job is there where you're presenting information? That's like one job. Like those are jobs. You are also worrying about you've planned assessments for the learners. You're worried about connecting with every single learner, and then you're also concerned about that they learn everything at the same rate at the same time. Like that's a heavy load. Um, but I think that we either have expectations of what the classroom should look like, and they should look like little robots learning, and that we're so concerned about ourselves and what we're conveying instead of what like the learning that's happening.
I don't think you could have summed that better.
Yeah, and I know like I'm in class sometimes, and like I have a lot of friends in my PhD classes, and we're texting each other, and we're like, "Oh my gosh, I didn't understand that example," or like sometimes we're laughing about things, So I get it. Like I get being a student and being like one of my kids, and that's like learning's messy, and that's sometimes what learning looks like, and it doesn't have to be like photo perfect every time. It can be messy and clunky.
Do you feel like, just to kind of tie this into what you do on the daily, do you feel like being invested in education in your own way plays a role, since you are now in that level of like, you're providing high quality instruction, but you're also providing high level of instructional content to hopefully kids that will take your ideas and your enthusiasm and take it into college? Do you feel like there's any correlation between the fact that you keep on striving to learn and be better? Obviously, content does change in your field. It's not so much history where we're just looking at current events. There's new discoveries and different components of that. But there's also that love of learning that transitions and is encouraging with a student body that's really close to choosing if college or a career is near.
I think one thing that they see, like they know I'm getting a PhD, so they see that like somebody in a tiny town in the middle of nowhere who's a teacher can work on a PhD, and so maybe they can do stuff like that too. And I've definitely like I've had I'm in my third year, so I haven't had any students like pursuing a PhD since I've started, but I've had a lot of students who have graduated a while ago and found out I'm getting a PhD and then decided to. And I've also had a lot of people in my community, my little tiny town, who are looking at PhD programs now. One person just moved to Washington to get a PhD. So I think that part is cool. Like we can do this, we can really challenge ourselves to make it happen. But I think a lot of the stuff that I'm learning now is not so much about science. It's about like how people learn. It's also, my PhD's in STEM research. So I'm learning about how students learn STEM more. And I'm definitely applying those methods. And I'm like pretty open with them when I'm learning new things or a new method. I'm like, hey, I learned this in a class. I want to try it out. What do you guys think? And they get pretty excited about that. Like whatever comes down the road, I'm ready to try, and they like that. So
I love taking that approach of being open and honest with the students that you're trying something new, whether it's a project idea or, like you said, an instructional strategy, and seeing if it works out or not. Can you speak to your community a little bit more, because it's very evident that it's important to you and that it's a big part of your profession as well as your school culture. And we've had many guests talk about how important community is, and learning that community, especially if we've had a few of our guests that moved into a new community or even a new state, and really understanding the demographic of who they're teaching and the values of that community. So can you speak to that a little bit more and how that possibly makes, your school and your area unique?
yeah, so my community is Southeast Montana, really rural. The main economy is probably oil and ranching and farming. And for example, we often don't even have an MD at our local clinic. So we often just have like a PA. So my students most of them have never seen a scientist or never known a scientist or an engineer. And a lot of them have scarcely ever seen a doctor, so those advanced degrees are kind of rare, even master's degrees or bachelor's. And really strong family values, really strong community. We do a lot of events together. We do brandings together, which is where we brand cattle and everybody comes and it's a big celebration. If there's like a benefit for somebody, the whole town turns out and they can raise like $50,000 in a night and stuff like that. So that's kind of what the community was like. But I grew up in El Paso, Texas, which was very different. And I went to school in Las Cruces, New Mexico. And like the school that I went to, I graduated with 600, and I probably knew like 100 kids that I graduated with. Like I didn't even know most of the school. And now my school there's probably 200 in the building, 7 through 12. So it's much smaller, much closer knit. The kids are involved in everything. Like they're in every sport and every extracurricular activity. And so we're always clamoring for them to do our events, because they're like stretched so thin. So that's kind of what it's like. And I really try to kind of broaden their horizons and show them like some of these other careers and options that they've never seen. Like I just did a STEM camp last week. It ended Saturday, with ages 5 through 12. And I brought in a STEM panel for them at the end where they got to like ask them questions. And I brought in a scientist and an engineer and a technologist and a mathematician. And like maybe a fourth of them said that they had met a scientist or an engineer before. Like the rest of them just had never seen one. And they have all these misconceptions about what scientists are like, right? Like that they own their own island or have like jet planes or like, like they're just like you and me. Like they probably make the same as teachers, most of them. And so I think like kind of showing them that it's not what's in the movies. It's like these are real life and real people and they're trying to make the world better. That's kind of, I guess, where I see my role in the community. So, and I did a thing with a kindergarten class once, and then I went to the grocery store after school, and one of the little kids was like, "Hey, Mom, that's a scientist. She came to our school today." And so, that's why you do it. Like, so they see that and they have a different picture in their heads of what it actually is.
It's crazy to me to think that. When I was teaching fifth grade, career readiness became more and more important throughout my years in fifth grade. And a big part of it was just trying to expose them to different careers. In our area, when they reach high school, they can go to a tech school that's kind of three districts that all commune here, where they can maybe explore like trades a little bit more or occupations like that as a part of their high school experience. And I always thought it was important to expose the students to more and more career options that are out there, try to help them understand it a little bit more. But even as fifth graders, that perspective of never knowing a scientist or never knowing an engineer, like that was something that I really didn't see. It was more of understanding a little bit more. So That really just paints a picture to the community that you're working with, and how valuable that impact is to you, Matt. I know your community is more rural than mine. Do you want to add anything to that specifically?
Yeah, so I think what's interesting, so I teach in Lancaster County, which is Amish kind of country in between Philadelphia and Harrisburg, our capital. And what's really interesting is we have a decent transient population. We have a huge farming and agricultural kind of interest, even though there's large cities very close to us. And a lot of the students do end up kind of growing up, graduating, and staying, and just kind of recycling through whatever family business, whether it was farming, whether it was the corner shop. And there's an incredible side of having appreciation for a community that, as an outsider who grew up in the suburbs of Philadelphia, I thought that there wasn't a community. And by teaching there, found out that the community where I teach, in my opinion, is way stronger than the facade of the community that I had. Just because there's a real dependence on every single member of that community to make everything happen. That is just incredible. I think you being, and you can kind of add to this or correct me if I'm wrong, you being almost a inspiration through your efforts, as well as also tapping into connections, like getting the ability to travel as the representative of Montana Teacher of the Year, and going to share but also bring back what education's like around the country is just a huge value to a population that probably loves to hear every story that you have to give, which is just incredible. So that unlocking of doors is really, it's a social service in your community. But I'm sure, do you feel, do you feel like, since sometimes I worry about if we have these family rotations and we have this value in where we live in the homestead area, the idea of expanding out weakens that local community. Have you ever had any pushback because of allowing kids to dream and really not necessarily settle for what has been before?
I was just thinking that as you were saying that. I think there's a danger of, um, have you heard of like brain drain, like where people move away? And so that's like a pretty big deal too. You know, that's like a hard balance. I have a student who's actually pursuing her PhD now in, I think it's in animal science, and her family is like a big ranching family, and they didn't want, like they said that they didn't think she could like get married if she got her PhD and stuff like that. So, so I guess like, and that's tough, you know, and she might end up back there. I mean, whatever happens, her sister's here, but I think that um there we also have to show them that there's like, if they go out and get a degree and come back, there's a real way that they can help to grow the community too and make it stronger, and that's also not a bad thing, right? Like we have a economic development person that I'm good friends with, and so she's really interested in like getting grants, helping businesses get kind of started and develop their business and get education that they need and get resources that they need to do better and grow the whole town and grow tourism. So I think that's a really good perspective to keep too. And there's also the part where a lot of times kids are, when they're an adolescent, they're like dissatisfied with their town, and they think there's nothing to do, which is valid in Baker, and so they just want to get out of town. So that's kind of a hard balance too, because that's healthy, like that's
That's
normal. I also
everywhere.
tell them
Yeah.
like, yeah, exactly. Like there's nowhere that's perfect. Every teenager's saying that, but I tell them you also have to make that shift and say like, look around you and ask yourself like, how can I make this better? Like, how can I make this community better? And maybe see the things that are wrong, because there's always going to be things that are wrong, but what can I do to make it better and kind of like help people, you know? Or I always tell them, to really make a community better, you need to help the kids. So like focus on the kids, and work with them, and that'll make the community better. So
That's great. Is the way you're having these conversations around improving the community and those types of things, is this through like extracurricular clubs, or is this being infused into your instructional routine with your classroom?
I definitely probably have the talk with all of them. I don't really know what specific lesson, but it always seems to come up like Baker's lame, and so I usually have that talk. Like, that's normal and healthy, and it's okay to look around and say, like, this is wrong. I don't like this. Um, but they also have, like, they petitioned to get bottle fillers in the high school on the water fountains. They were concerned about, we don't have recycling services. So I had a student go with me to a meeting in Miles City, which is 100 miles from here. It's the nearest Walmart and McDonald's. And we went to one of the meetings to talk to them about getting recycling in our town. That was right before COVID, though. So then we haven't pursued anything since. And then we had a tornado in our lake I think it was 5 years ago. And they had to drain and dredge the whole lake because it was filled with, like, houses after the tornado. And so then they actually, like, got a $4 million grant or something, and they, like, redid the whole lake, and they put all these, like, really nice like, outdoor sites you can do, like, water sports. And so during that process, I had the commissioners come a bunch of times, and the kids worked with them to plan out what did they want at the lake based on the budget. Like, do you want a beach here? Do you want a dock here? Do we need fish habitat over here? What kind of plants? Students got to pick what kind of fish they wanted in the lake to fish for. And we looked at, like, okay, what's your top predator? And then we kind of did, like, a food web, and they decided on which were the best ones. So they have done projects like that, where they get a say in their community, and the outcome was amazing. Like, we have the best features around the lake. It's just, I can't believe it's free. I can't believe that you can just access it anytime. It's like a country club. So we do things like that kind of involve them.
That's amazing that you were able to do that with them, and real world experiences like that. It's a project where you wish you could do every year because it was so
Right.
impactful. But the best part of it is that it was real and it was happening in that moment. But it also lives as a legacy to other students as you go through that program, so they can see. They can, even when you get to that unit, you can still talk about that experience and how they did it, or, could they improve it? You could have future grade levels say, how could we improve that? So that's really neat. So, as we kind of dive into your classroom a little bit more, just paint us a broad picture of what your classroom looks like on a daily basis. Is it instructor led? Is it student led? Is it based on labs? Is it based on lectures? Like, what does your classroom look like? How would your students describe learning in your classroom?
So we mostly do, like, longer term projects. But I would say that when I do lecture, and it's not really lecturing because it's more like a conversation. And so this works really well for me. I'll have maybe, like, a diagram or a figure or a picture on the whiteboard or the smartboard, whatever, and then we'll talk about it. I usually don't put a whole lot of words. They're not copying notes. So we'll discuss it, we'll make sense of it, and then they'll summarize their notes on their own. And they know, like, when the next slide comes up, you're not writing anything. We're just going to wait and talk and absorb and learn it, and then we're going to summarize the information. So we kind of, like, it kind of, I think it's stupid to copy notes, first of all, but we kind of, like, take that first step of learning and then summarizing, and that really works well for us. And it also helps the students when they are, like, it helps them not plagiarize, because they have to learn how to summarize things and put it in their own words. And then the projects we do are usually open-ended. We do a lot of inquiry projects. So instead of doing, like, a traditional lab where it's like a canned cookbook lab, I might use the same concept, but they have to design their own experiment, and they can each test something different. Like, if we're doing a yeast experiment, like growing yeast, making CO2, one group might choose to, like, change the temperature. One might choose to change the type of sugar. So there's, like, a whole bunch of different things they can change, and every group's doing something different. They all have a different outcome, and then they share their results later. So we have a lot of those. I usually don't do any traditional like regular labs unless they're, something quick. Those are like the 1 day things. And then we do projects. We write a lot of papers. The projects that we do are, like I can give you an example of one. Like there's one that I do with grizzly bears because we have a grizzly bear population in Montana and Yellowstone. And they had been on the endangered species list since like 1975 or something. And a few years ago, they delisted them. So they took them off the endangered species list. They were the first thing to ever be delisted. And they decided that their population was stable enough. And then there were a bunch of lawsuits from there were 6 lawsuits, but 2 of them were from tribes. We have 7 reservations in Montana. So 2 of them were for tribes. And they sued them because they also have rights to manage the grizzly bears. So they also have that jurisdiction, and they won. So the bear was relisted. So what we do with that unit is they actually get real data of the grizzly bear populations, how many females, how many males, how many young, different things like that. And they look at the actual parameters that the Department of Interior used to decide whether they were going to delist them or not. And then they evaluate it to see if they met those parameters, and they don't actually. And but it's complicated. Like it's not straight cut, right? Like it's like it'll say like for 6 years they had to do this, but it's like, well, is it 6 consecutive years? Because they didn't for 6 consecutive years, but they did for 6 years over the last 20, like stuff like that. And then they prepare a document and recommendations and stuff. And then we do this pinwheel discussion where some of the kids are representing like tribal nations. So some of them represent tribal scientists, some of them are tribal council members, and then we have state scientists and like a district court judge sometimes. And they'll read the job descriptions of each of those. So we'll like dig into what those people actually do, like how they actually operate, what their values are, what's important to them. We watch like stuff from tribal elders, what they think about grizzly bears, stuff like that, sometimes guest speakers. And then we do a pinwheel discussion where they discuss like the management of the grizzly bear and whether it should be delisted and stuff. And the neat thing with that is like those types of conversations with those entities don't really happen in real life. Like that sort of a pinwheel between tribal government and state government doesn't really happen in Montana. So it's kind of a good way to model like, this is how we can make decisions. You guys are going to be the leaders someday, right? Like the leaders of our community. And this is how you're going to make decisions someday. This is a good way to do it and to consider different perspectives. And we have I have another one on Flathead Lake, which is in like by Glacier. Half the lake the tribe owns and half the lake the state owns. So, and there's an invasive species in there that crashed the food web, and it's really hard to manage. So we do another one with that on how to manage that.
That's very cool.
Holy
very cool.
Smokes. I think like when talking about like your passion is obviously STEM related, so the idea of science integrated with technology and engineering and mathematics. But one of the things Ken and I like to talk about is STEM is really the integration of just almost acquisition based learning. What do I need to know? What do I need to gather? What research? And it's a shame that, and I'm not saying anything wrong against science teachers that tend to do the same old lab that they've often done, but if you lose sight of almost that scientific method initial, like what is the purpose behind this, you pull in real world community based. And a few of the things that you've said, like the project with a local after the tornado, and as well as this, like when talking about Baker being boring or not wanting to be there, you have these layers and layers and layers of community pride that only enhance the value, and when they go into that real world can make a huge difference. And that opportunity is what every kid should get all the time. That's the beauty of STEM. Realistically, when STEM is working well, it's the idea of, okay, I'm not going to say we're only doing this because I have reached the end of science class or I've reached the end of math class today. We're going to transition to something different. I don't know if project-based learning is a great way to put it, but it is realistically the just like the balance or the benefit of using all skills. And it's different in my classroom. I teach fourth grade than your classroom in the high school, but we deal with many of the same challenges. Both of these really lean into problems that kids don't feel like they can have an impact on. So the motivation is lost there, but there is no end in sight a lot of times. In your classroom, you're probably not going to solve that problem, but I think what you almost concluded with was when you are in power, when you have the ability to make a change, you know how to consider, first thing, all of the setting, all of the environment, all of the people that might be involved, the thoughts, and then bring really good research skills to balance and go from, okay, this is my prediction, and see it through a conclusion. I think when it comes down to that, like that's a beautiful but exhausting thing for you to have, because the nature of these projects, there's real world feedback, and there's again a lot of data, but you're not like, where are you sourcing that from? How much do you feel like, or how often do you bring outside sources into the classroom as authentic, I guess, feedback or data, like those type of things? Because I feel like, for instance, the tribe's perspective, or whether it's from the local government, or where you're getting data from, is it a fairly open class in that sense, or are you kind of vetting the information that you're providing to the kids?
It depends on the level. So most of like the two that I talked about were with sophomores, and they're not like they haven't honed their research skills yet. So like the data I get from, I have somebody at the Department of the Fish and Wildlife. So I get the data from them, like the raw data. And there was a whole report. That's where I got the parameters that they have to check. So I got that from the report. I give them some of that. And then I give them like articles about the lawsuits. So most of that I give them like, this is the information. And after they kind of go through all of that, and when they're preparing for the pinwheel, that's when they go out and do some of their own research to pull in information to prep for the pinwheel. And same with the Flathead Lake one, because they find out that it was the mysis shrimp that were introduced, and they're invasive, and that's what caused the food web to crash. And so after they've like solved the mystery, because they have to actually solve it and figure out that it's the shrimp, then they can go out and see like, how have these been managed? How are the tribes managing it? How's the state? This is actually like a widespread problem in the Northwest. A lot of lakes have the shrimp. So that's when they kind of go out and do more research and find more information. And there's not really any rules at that point. Like they can just find any information they want. They usually have it printed and ready. And so it's kind of like getting ready for court when they get ready for the pinwheel, because they have all their papers and they're like discussing, because it's, I don't know if I described the pinwheel, but there's like 4 kids in the middle and then their group is behind them. And then they switch out every question. So they have like little timeouts where they discuss and then come back, and, so it's really fun. And it's pretty like we work a lot on, I give them like talk rules, like how to have a constructive conversation and not talk over each other, and like how to kind of what's the word, like if somebody says something and they're like, I see what you're saying there, what do you think about this? So kind of bouncing off ideas off of people, and being constructive instead of trying to find the common ground instead of trying to be right. So we talk through some of those things, and and we do at least 3 of those a year, 3 of those projects in sophomore year. So they get a lot of practice.
Can I just
doing their little
just to add to this, I know Ken and I have talked about before that open-ended learning and some of these like big what we know are really good for education and really good for the mind. Those type instructional methods are really difficult. They're difficult on us. They're also difficult on kids. Can you kind of speak to why you think it's difficult and what you do to create structure to kind of guide students, especially like your sophomores, as they're kind of building up their chops on how to do this. They don't just naturally become, maybe there's maturity, but they don't naturally become a better researcher from sophomore to senior year unless they've done a lot of practice. But open-ended learning is something we all want to incorporate, but there's some things to consider. So I know that's a loaded question, but I will let you kind of to jump into it from any direction you like.
Yeah, I definitely know what you mean, and lecturing is a lot easier than any of this, for sure. But in some ways, sometimes this other or whatever you want to call it, project-based learning is also easier sometimes when they're working on stuff. I really like thinking about logistics in the classroom and how I'm going to set the space up and what they're interacting with. And it's not like I've probably done the grizzly bear one for 4 years maybe, and I change it every year a little bit, but it's not like it was great the first year. Like, it was clunky. I didn't have the spreadsheets right. I gave them too much data. It was a mess, but they were very gracious, you know. But what I don't even remember what I did then, because I've changed it so much. But what I have now is I have a lot of templates. So like the grizzly bear one, they actually change groups. So they're in, it's ridiculous. It's too much. But they start out in one group, and then they do that, and then they go into another group and they do that, and I think they change groups a third time, which I probably shouldn't do. So I have like class slideshows with templates, so they know what they're supposed to be doing. They put their names, they know what they're working on. They each have different slides, but they can scroll up and down and look at each other's. And I was all in person this year, so we're just in a classroom together working on that. And so I just kind of have like each piece set up and kind of organized and structured so they know what they're doing and it's not confusing. And they'll tell me when it is, you know, like sometimes it's just awful. And, you know, you just, let's start over tomorrow. That was terrible, you know. So I think it's about like setting up the space and setting up the learning and thinking through how that's going to go, and like being okay with it being messy and messing up and learning from it. You know, we're going to try this new thing today and we'll see how it goes, and you will all help me. You all can be my guinea pigs, and you can help me to make this better. And I always ask them at the end too, like, what could we have done to do better? And they usually say like, I could have worked harder. And I'm like, no, I don't. I want you to tell me what I could have done.
Yeah.
That's not, you know, I'm not trying to be a jerk to you. Like, what do I need to do to make this better? You know? So yeah. I have another really cool lesson that that we do that's like cross-curricular, that's like the highlight of senior year for my kids. We do a CSI case, and the last 3 years it's been local based. So my science research class will design the case and write it and make all the evidence. So like 2 years ago, we did this sheriff who was shot in the jailhouse, which is now the museum, in like 1947, and it was like an unsolved mystery. So because I'm my sister-in-law is the museum curator, so she like finds all these things in the newspapers. And so they built the case around that, and they like wrote this whole story around it. They had fake people, but they actually like went and photographed his gravestone, and they found the rifle that was used. It was in the museum. And there was like this other sheriff that was running for office, and so they worked it in where the other sheriff actually won, and then the sheriff who got killed, burned the ballots. So he would win. So we made like fake burned ballots and set off the fire alarm at school. And then we hid the evidence in the museum, which was the jail where he died. And there's this one room where he died where like the wind blows and it echoes and you can like hear voices. So we hid stuff in the walls, and like in the basement, there's a creepy basement that's just dirt. Anyway, so they solved so anyway, they wrote the case, they did all that. They put everything in the jailhouse, and then my chemistry class came and gathered the evidence, and they worked in teams. They solved the case, and then they presented it to the government classes, and they tried the case. So we have 3 government classes. One was defense, one was prosecution, one was the jury. And so they worked on it for a week. They subpoenaed the witnesses or whatever. and all of that. And then we took it to the county courthouse and did the trial there, did the whole trial. And we had like the witnesses, we had it for the afternoon, had the witnesses come up, went through the whole thing. And then I was the one on trial that time. I was his fiance. And according to the story, I actually shot him, but who knows what actually happened.
You can tell us the truth right here and right now if you want.
The fiance was the one who found him dead. So it was always very, like, ooh, what happened? And I got off because I was like advising the lawyers because I was on this, the little whatever, I don't know all the words. And we have like the jurors go back in the jury room and they deliberate. So that one's really fun because it's like local and like the whole senior class participates, like every senior. And every year they're like, hey, I know another one we should do. Like, did you hear about this thing, So this year we did, one of the old schools burned down in like 1967. And so we made it arson and like interviewed firefighters that fought the fire, all of that. And there we had artifacts from the museum. And so those are really fun too.
That is amazing.
It's fabulous.
That is. And what I just want to say is, we're sitting here with the Montana Teacher of the Year, and she's talking about this incredible project that is involving really the entire senior body, multiple classes. There is no way that the first time you did that project, it went well. I mean, it went decent. Like, it's things like that are not going to go perfectly when you roll it out. But you had a great idea, and it could have gotten to the point where, like, that sounded like a great idea, and the first time you did it, it just didn't work out. It clearly did. You're doing it multiple times, and you've perfected it, but there are times where you have grand ideas like that. I've had many of those that I guinea pig with my students, and it never sees the life of a classroom again. And I mentioned this on one of our early shows that I would like to say to my students, like, we're going to try a new project. I've never done it before. We're going to see if it works. If it works, I'll do it next year with my class. And I'll say, you remember that project where we did, whatever it was? And they say, yeah, like that was a lot of fun. I said, well, that was a guinea pig 2 years ago. And then I'll mention another project and say, you remember that one? And they're like, no, I don't remember that. I said, yeah, because it was a disaster 3 years ago and I never did it again. So we don't know which way it's going to go. But those things are not going to go perfectly the first time you do it. But you have to take that risk. And so I kind of wanted to hit on this topic as well, and Matt jumped on it. It is difficult, but you did mention that at times when you get into this mode, it's not more difficult. I always like to say that I worked extremely hard when the students weren't in the classroom, but when they were in the classroom, I wasn't working that hard. My job was to just, support them, have conversations with them, pull small groups, do simple things, just kind of go with the flow and fall into my natural skill set as a teacher. And so what is it, in your opinion, why don't more teachers do this? I mean, this is not common, and not even to something to that extreme. Like, that was really intense. I loved it. But even the more simple versions of open-ended learning, why don't more teachers teach like this? Is it just because it seems too hard? I don't believe that's the reason, because teachers are probably the hardest working community out there. Is it they're afraid to take risks? Like, what is it that you think prevents teachers from instructing this way more?
I think that some teachers have never seen it or learned that way. I think that's one, like there are so, like, I'm doing a curriculum thing this summer, and they're doing so many cool things I've never seen and I've never learned that way, and I love it. And if I've never seen it, how can I teach it? I went to a middle school that had like humanities, and so it was like 3 periods, and I don't know, it was like English and social studies, and I don't even know which was which, because like it was just all mushed together like it should be. And it was amazing. We did cool projects like this, so I learned in that way and I loved it. And then I got to high school and it was lame. So I was like, middle school is like, I learned so much in middle school. Like, I learned how to do all the things I'm doing now. So I, like, a lot of it I pull from that. And I know, like, you kind of know, I think I knew early on, like, gosh, what I'm doing isn't right. And I know that there's something better. I just don't really know how to do it, right? Like I need somebody to show me. And once I see it, I'll know. Like I just don't know how to implement it. So I think that's probably the biggest thing. And then I think the other thing is a lot of teachers don't feel like they have the permission to. Like, no, you have to cover these things. And maybe if you have time at the end of the year, you can do these fun things. But you have to do all these other boring things because that's what school's supposed to look like. Because somebody said, because that's what your school looked like. That's how you were taught. So I think like it's kind of like giving yourself permission to do these other things, and they're gonna remember. Like my students remember Flathead Lake and Grizzly Bear thing. Like I mean, they're like 30 and they're talking. Like they'll remember that forever. And the invasive species and keystone species and the food webs and how to manage an ecosystem. Like that's how you learn that stuff. That's a whole couple chapters in ecology. We might as well learn it that way in a couple weeks, and they're gonna remember it forever.
Absolutely.
And like it's almost like you don't have time not to do that.
I 100% agree. And like you said, the fear of like that's not what school is supposed to look like, and I've heard, maybe not directly asked towards me, but I've heard this topic of conversation, like, what if the kids don't learn as much, or how do I know they're going to learn as much, or I see you doing more and more creative things in your classroom, like is it impacting what your students are learning, or even like the topic of state testing. For me as a fifth grade teacher, state testing was a big part of our expectation, and I will flat out say you could pull up all my scores from all my years. It never changed. Like my scores stayed pretty much the same year to year. So the more open-ended learning I brought in, it maybe had a slight positive impact on the test score, but on the learning experience and the actual retention and understanding of the curriculum, it had astronomical impacts in terms of my assessments that I was doing with them. So they were still getting that basic understanding that was needed, but the higher level understanding exceeded it astronomically.
I think I think the hard part really comes down to, at least in the elementary realm, is a lot of our curriculums are scripted at this point. So there's an element of almost feeling like you're going against the grain on an area or a topic where it tells you how to ask every question and the process by which everything should go. And I think I'm very fortunate to have great administration that says this is your guideline that you use, but you're not living by that. You're not, like, that is not what you are, not paid to be a robot that delivers that content. But that's not always the case. And one of the things that I guess homework is a weird comparison, but the way that I think, Linda, you would have a similar response is, if my teaching isn't creating experiences where the kids want to go home and extend their learning, then I don't feel like I'm doing justice in the classroom. The best feeling is when the kids go home and fill their night and we have to stop them. And it doesn't happen all the time, right? And it may not be, I structured this project that my kids are all going to get into. But I might have 4 kids that totally dive deep here, and 3 weeks later, another group of kids totally different, or maybe a few the same. But that, in my ideas, homework is a different story. But creating learning experiences, and that leads to what you're talking about, which is this, hey, I remember that. It's kind of like the classic, I remember how to say all the states in order because of the song I learned in music type scenario. It sticks with you. Of all things in elementary school, I don't know why that stuck with me, but those type learning experiences, I know that there are a few and they may be different for each kid, but that's the beauty and that is the motivation of that open-ended learning. Because at the end of the day, we all know this, we've all heard it. The permission is the big key there. The learning is the experience, right? Like STEM being robotics, there's a huge push in STEM to include dash robots or makey coding, those type things. That is the payoff of hard work and the learning process and the failing up until that point to see with high reward, low risk, were you successful? That is not, we're not just playing with robotics. We're working our way through the process in a different way of thinking. And you can apply that in open-ended learning and project-based learning and all these other facets that really pull just deep learning opportunities where the kids eat it up. That's what we're all going for. And just like we want our kids to eat it up, Linda, I'm sure you explode with excitement gathering materials. So when Ken talks about doing all that work ahead of time so that you're just existing's a bad way, but I think, Ken, how you said it, tapping into your natural abilities as a facilitator is a beautiful way to say, you know, I have to be really excited about it beforehand, and I have to have my ducks in a row in order to make that experience, because a great idea is all based off execution. We all know that. But that's the scary thing of especially starting out a new project and not knowing all the things you need to know. It's daunting, but you only cross that bridge by trying it.
Right, right. And I think I was thinking about earlier what you were saying about like the first time it definitely wasn't like that, right? And like my first time ever doing like a CSI case, we just did like some of the tests. Like I think I made up a lame scenario and I just had them do tests and they looked at dog hair. I don't know. And then the next year they wanted to like actually make a story. So we did that and we like videoed them and like made it fuzzy and pretended it was like security video, you know, and just every year, but it was like student led, like they wanted to keep upping the ante, right? And like making it cooler. Like we had the videos from last year and they were like, well, that's cool, but we can do better, you know? And so it kind of became like a legacy. And then I was in the background, like, okay, how do I craft like this template that we're going to use? How, like, what order do I do it in? How are we going to make the suspects and make sure there's incriminating evidence for all of them? You know, so I was kind of facilitating it, but they just got to run with the creativity and then you also like as a facilitator, you have to be like, okay, is this like this year, one student wanted to make a 3D model of the building and print it. And I was like, go for it, but let's start with the blueprint. Like we need a drawn blueprint. And then if you finish that, then we can 3D print it. And we didn't, you know, it's like you have to know kind of how to like frame that and like encourage them, but also be realistic with time and, you know, but kind of let them lead, I think. And be okay with messing up. And like at the end of the CSI thing, at the end of the courtroom day, we all get together and say like, how could this have gone better? Like what was missing? What would have been better? What did you need? And they all get to talk. Like it's all out in the open. Everybody knows the case and what actually happened and how can we do better next year for the next senior class, you know? So it's not like you have to dive into that, right? You can definitely work towards it.
Absolutely. So this would normally be the portion of the show where we jump into the lesson lens, but you hit it almost all of our questions spot on. So I don't want to kind of circle back to that or force the conversation that way. The way you painted the picture of, frankly, of the Grizzly Project, the CSI, you've done a great job. I've really enjoyed this. We're gonna ask one of the questions. I want to add another layer, and you already started on the topic that I wanted to jump towards. So, you know, we talked about how like you can't get it right the first time, and you talked about how you kind of you had stepping stones towards that, where it started as a small activity and it kind of grew and grew. When you're planning the logistics of the lesson, like you said, and you're kind of ready to step into this kind of big idea that you have that you want to unfold, do you over prepare and then kind of reflect and see where you gave the wrong direction, you did the wrong step, or do you under prepare and kind of share the big vision and work on the fly? I personally work on the fly. I know where I want it to go, and I provide the students, I'll say as little as I think they need, and then I keep like giving them more as we go through to then say, okay, next year when I do this, this is what I have to provide them in this step. This is what I have to provide them in the next step. That's kind of been my approach. Do you understand what I'm saying? Like, what's your approach when you're doing that? Is it one of those two, somewhere in the middle?
I think it depends. So, like with the CSI case, I'm definitely underprepared. It's a small research class, and so if you picture what it looks like they're just all like there in the room, and we're all talking, and then I'm just at the computer typing and trying to like record what they're thinking and make tables to summarize their thoughts, but they're just all discussing. Um, and then I might work a little bit to say like, okay, so they were saying this, so I better make this like this and ask them what they want to do with this. So I'm just kind of like the, I don't know, creator of space, I guess. And we have like, okay, we always are going to have 4 suspects. We're always going to have at least 2 pieces of evidence to incriminate them. So we have like that structure. And I show them last year's the main 45-page document, the running huge thing. But with other ones like the sophomore grizzly bear stuff, I have all of the documents ready, like all of the templates, all the class files that they're all working on. I usually have that all ready, but it's super open-ended. But that's usually like sort of prepared. I also do like, there's this life straw one that we do where we make little filters with different materials, and they test the water before and after, and they test for like pH turbidity and salinity and stuff. And that's a lot more open-ended, but it's changed. And like that's the thing I did with the STEM camp the other day, and I had that really structured. So like I had it way more structured than I would for my big kids. So I think it just depends on like the nature of the project, and then sometimes I regret not having more structure, and sometimes I regret not having less structure. It depends on the kids. Like you could do the exact same project, and they're going to interact with it differently, you know.
Absolutely. Normally, we would ask as the last part of this is advice you would give yourself. But I think what you just said had something that I want to adjust. What is your reflection? Like, what are some of your reflection questions that you ask yourself about the success and then how you'd want to grow for next time? So obviously, as you mentioned, kids are a variable, but you're obviously taking from an open-ended project and saying, hey, I want to grow this further. What is some of that evaluation? Are you asking the kids as much? How does that go to make and enhance for the next time?
So one thing that I do is for science, we have the next generation science standards, and we have 7 practices. And so we look at those practices to see like which ones do you think you really like leaned into in this project, and which ones are still challenging for you. And that help, like if all of them are saying like I really got these, like okay, good. So we really practiced those well, and these are the ones that we didn't. And whether or not, like sometimes I didn't mean to, like sometimes that wasn't the practice we were going for, stuff like that. And we also, so they do a lot of metacognition. So we just like kind of reflect on like, how did your learning go? How confident did you feel about doing, about your learning? Because that's really important in science too, like science identity, and their growth. And then I also, so I guess as you were talking, I was thinking about this. I took an action research class once, which is like research in your classroom. So you like do a lesson, collect data on it, analyze it, things like that. And so I would do things like I would teach a lesson, and then the next day I would ask them to like write a 1-sentence summary of that lesson. And then I would take that and like what content was in there, I would code it and make a pie chart. Like if it was a climate change lesson, gosh, 2/3 of them learned about this and I didn't mean for them to, right? And then like the 1/3 learned about what I meant for them to. So I haven't done that very much because it's a lot of work, but I think about that a lot. Like the learning that they do can be different, right? Like every kid can leave the room learning something different, and that's okay and that's good. But I kind of have to be aware of like I said at the beginning, like the stuff that comes out of my mouth isn't necessarily what they're learning. It's way, way more complex than that. But I guess like I do want to make sure that their learning is meaningful and that it connects to them. I guess that's probably what I look for the most. Like, can they see themselves in science? Like, can they see themselves as science being a part of their lives and them like playing a role in science? That's probably the most important thing. More than like the facts we teach them, like it's going to be like whether or not they can be citizen scientists or real scientists or whatever is going to depend on like how they see themselves in science and if they feel competent. And that they can learn, they can be science learners. Like all of that is probably way more important than any content. But I do want them to know like they should wear sunscreen, and like try to prevent cancer and things like that. But so yeah, I guess those are probably the things I look for. But it's that feeling. I was thinking when you were saying that you do all the work before and then you just like do the teaching there. And I think that's when the magic happens. Like when you're interacting in small groups with students and working on these projects together and just moving from group to group and listening to what they're saying, that's when you're assessing them, but that's when they're becoming student scientists. Like right, like when you sit down next to them and really listen and talk through and let them talk and tell them that they have great ideas, right? And like help push them deeper. That's the good stuff. And that's why it's worth it to do these projects, because you don't get to do that. You don't get to know your students if you're just lecturing all the time, right? Like as people, you know? So I think that's one of the reasons why these projects are so effective.
100%. And not only, we talked a lot about how we feel it has a better impact on learning, but like you just said, your relationships with the students are 1,000 times better because you actually get to have one-on-one conversations with them, usually content related, or sometimes you're just there just having a casual conversation, asking them how their weekend was, or whatever the case may be. And so you absolutely get that out of that. And Matt, I really like that question that you asked about what are those reflection questions that you ask yourself after you try a new lesson, you try a new project, because that's such an important piece for us to do to be able to learn and grow and modify. And I really believe when you do activities like that, you can find opportunity to improve. This past year, I worked with a teacher that was trying a new format for how he was managing multiple texts in his high school English class. And there was a very active role for students and a passive role, depending on which group was up for the conversation. And he didn't prepare anything for the passive students to do while they watched a different discussion. And he said, next year when I do this, they're going to do X, Y, and Z. He's like, I should have had that prepared for this time. I said, no, you shouldn't have, because you focused on the active students. And frankly, if you had prepared something for the passive students just to have something to do or just to check the box, you wouldn't have found a more meaningful way for them to engage when they're in that role. So by sometimes not having everything prepared, you can take a better approach in seeing what would be a better fit here. Whereas if you have all of the boxes checked, you might not find a better way to do it, or a more exciting way to do it, or a more higher level way of thinking for the students.
One of the things that I just want to add to it too is there's an element, like we started this conversation where you mentioned, Linda, a few times where you're kind of an inspiration for the community, you're addressing kind of community pride, and you're also really pulling these life skills for the kids into the classroom. That is a huge thing. That is beautiful. But you've in this conversation, I just want to highlight it. I wish that this would be probably not 50 minutes into the episode, but like there's an element of when we talk about new teachers or teachers that transition to a harder to get started type of learning, this is all what's part of it. But we hear, okay, be reflective and think about it. Or, oh, try this project-based learning. I think in the same sense of you being really helpful in those ways, you also just laid out the extent of what real learning could look like. The idea that your research criminal CSI project ended up in a courthouse with actual like members. Obviously, there's elements of fiction. Well, they may not think of it that way through their research, but the fact that it could go to that extent and that was embraced, it didn't have to, but that was probably someone said, and I'm sure you could probably run down the lineage of, oh, I have this opportunity. They heard about this. This sister's works as the clerical office. Like, there are connections in communities that can always enhance. And when you are doing incredible things and not kind of limiting those possibilities, it can get out of hand really quickly, but in a pretty incredible way. And I think just as much as that inspiration, I just want to pull back that we as the teacher don't have to feel responsible to grow it. We just need to manage it and recognize that, hey, I don't feel like, I love that we could have an electrician in to teach us all about how they wire up a house. We just need to put a single cell and a light bulb to get, like, it doesn't need to go that far, but having that possibility, that snowball effect, is the beauty of what this opens up. And you create the opportunity, Ken creates that opportunity, good teaching creates that opportunity, and then doesn't forget about the reflection side of things. So awesome, awesome stuff.
And a lot of times it's the students leading that snowball
Absolutely.
stuff.
And their connections. Hey, they're going to get really into it. They're going to try to one up the other group or whatever the case may be. And then their siblings heard and thought about it for years. That's the beauty of the first day of school. I've been waiting to come into your room because I've been excited about that type project.
Said it perfectly there, my friend Matthew. Thank you very much. So with that, this will actually transition perfectly into our first question, the exit ticket. What is the best thing a teacher can do to make a student's school experience better?
I think for me, what I've seen, especially from like at-risk students, like students that are at risk for dropping out, is that you help them to see their scientific self, and help them to have confidence. And so I think that we can celebrate like every little piece of learning, every little moment. And once they see that, because a lot of our students have like never had a teacher celebrate that. And so that, I think those are the moments when I've really seen students kind of shift, and kind of plug into school because they've spent the last 10 years with a different experience. So that's what I would say, is the best thing that we can give them. And we're teaching humans. I'm not teaching science. I'm teaching humans. Like, that's what I'm here for. So
That's perfectly said. Just tapping into advice, whether it's from a kid, a colleague, or someone from like supervisor, college, whatever the case may be. What's a piece of advice that sticks with you that you bring into each day of teaching?
I think that, probably letting the students lead their learning is probably what sticks with me. And also kind of like seeing them as individuals, as themselves, and not expecting them to be robots. Um, and I think you have to live that out too. Like, you can say that, but you actually have to show them. Like, if we're doing a lecture and one of them has a question and they want to dive deep into something, that's what we're doing the rest of the day. We stop what my plan was and we do their plan. And then they see that, like, I might say that, but I also mean it. And then maybe next week we'll have a project all about that, or they'll help me design a project. Like, you really show them that you mean it and that they're really leading their learning. And I really, like, I care about what they think. I need to know what they think. I need to know how they learn better. And sometimes that's not clear. Like, sometimes I can't tell. I need to ask them and they need to tell me. Or sometimes they use their body language. Like, I tell them, if they see me spending more time with one group than the other, it's totally okay to do like a deep annoyed sigh. Like, if they're raising their hand and I'm not coming over, like, that's a great way to communicate too. Like, so yeah, so that's what I think about.
Just don't know, like, is flipping the desk a little bit
Yeah, that's
too
a
much
little
in
too
terms
much.
of
Like, but if
okay,
I don't
all right.
respond, like,
If you ignore the sigh, that's the next
yeah,
step.
right?
So the school year goes in waves for teachers, and there's definitely points of struggle with conferences, report cards, those moments where everything is just piling up on us. So when a teacher is in that moment, what can you say to help them power up?
Hmm. Um, I think that there are always seasons. I guess I had some of those moments. I had some of those moments myself this year. And I had some moments with other teachers where we were crying and talking through some hard stuff. And I would say something like, you know what, last week you told me that you saw that like one student really told you that you made a difference to them. And so even if it's just that one student this year, it's worth it. Like even if you're just making a difference for one kid, and all the other stuff looks bad and ugly and hard, and it was a crazy year, like that one student makes it worth it. And just like when our kids are learning and maybe they're struggling with a lot of stuff, but they made this one, right? Like this, they did this one thing and they made this one area of growth, like then that's worth it. We can focus on that and like kind of put the other stuff in the back seat, I guess. So that's kind of how we encouraged ourselves, I guess, through the last year because there were some really, really tough times. And I guess like also remembering why we're doing it and yeah, how like we every teacher impacts kids, some for the worse, but most for the better, you know. And and it can be messy. It's okay if it's messy. Like we're just a bunch of humans in the room trying to figure things out together and it's not going to be perfect, you know.
Yep.
You said it earlier, we're not teaching robots, we're not teaching scientists, we're teaching humans. And I think you summed it up really well. You have shared a ton of awesome things, both really cool projects, but also just great mindset for instruction and how a classroom can be. What would you say if someone's listening to this and wants to follow along and hear more from you or touch base to, hey, I want to jump into open learning opportunities or I want to just kind of pick your brain a little bit more, what would be the best way to reach out or follow along with the activities in your classroom?
I have a YouTube channel that has some like videos of my students doing some of the projects. So there's quite a few of those, and we have the full CSI cases, the full court like thing, all of the court. And then I also just got a publication in NSTA's The Science Teacher for July, August on a media literacy unit. So that just came out if anyone gets NSTA's publications. And I'm on Twitter. So my Twitter handle's at 2020 Montana Toy. So those are probably the best ways, I think. I've submitted a couple more publications for different practitioner journals, but I haven't heard back yet. So I did one for the CSI case. So it's kind of like a framework of how to do your own. But I haven't got like it's in they're interested, but I don't know if they're gonna publish it yet.
Evaluation, yeah.
That's
Very
awesome.
cool.
Very cool. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. We will, as always, link to all of that and your social media handles and your YouTube channel on our show notes on our website, which is poweredup.com/show29 for this episode in particular. Linda, thank you so much. You have, as Matt said, you shared a lot, a really big picture of mindset and how to involve the community and how to be an inspiration, as well as those practical pieces with the CSI and the different projects. Anything that you want to share on our website as well, we can help put that on there for others to take the CSI or the logistics behind that. I think would be great to share on our website as well. And I thought of this as we were closing down here. One more way that you could possibly inspire in your community. Now, I'm sure you've been on a podcast before, but perhaps you being on a podcast, your community seeing that, perhaps someone will take the CSI project and develop like a Montana conspiracy theory podcast, because there seems to be a lot of shady things that have happened over the last decade in Montana. So it's expanding my knowledge beyond the show Yellowstone that I'm heavily involved in right now. But seriously, thank you so much. It's been a lot of fun. It's very evident why you are the Teacher of the Year for your state, and your community and your kids are super lucky to have you and to be able to experience your classroom. So thanks for joining us. And Matt, why don't you take us on out of here?
Linda, you were incredible. But as we powered down this episode, you left us feeling powered up. Everyone, hopefully you're all good, healthy, happy, and gearing up for another great school year. We'll talk to you next week.